Chapter 7 of the Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Joan Freeman. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 7. That it was past midnight, and Mary Standish had deliberately come to his room, entering it and closing the door without a word or a nod of invitation from him, seemed incredible to Allan. After his first explosion of astonishment he stood mute, while the girl looked at him steadily, and her breath came a little quickly. But she was not excited. Even in his amazement he could see that. What he had thought was fright had gone out of her eyes, but he had never seen her so white, and never had she appeared quite so slim and childish-looking as while she stood there in these astounding moments with her back against the door. The pallor of her face accentuated the rich darkness of her hair. Even her lips were pale, but she was not embarrassed. Her eyes were clear and unafraid now, and in the poise of her head and body was a sureness of purpose that staggered him. A feeling of anger, almost of personal resentment, began to possess him as he waited for her to speak. This, at last, was the cost of his courtesies to her. The advantage she was taking of him was an indignity and an outrage, and his mind flashed to the suspicion that Rosalind was standing just outside the door. In another moment he would have brushed her aside and opened it, but her quiet face held him. The tenseness was fading out of it. He saw her lips tremble, and then a miracle happened. In her wide-open, beautiful eyes tears were gathering. Even then she did not lower her glance or bury her face in her hands, but looked at him bravely while the teardrops glistened like diamonds on her cheeks. He felt his heart give way. She read his thoughts, had guessed his suspicion, and he was wrong. You will have a seat, Miss Standish?" he asked lamely, inclining his head toward the cabin chair. "No. Please let me stand." She drew in a deep breath. "It is late, Mr. Holt?" "Rather an irregular hour for a visit such as this," he assured her. "Half an hour after midnight, to be exact. It must be very important business that has urged you to make such a hazard aboard ship, Miss Standish." For a moment she did not answer him, and he saw the little heart throb in her white throat. "Would Belinda Mulrooney have considered this a very great hazard, Mr. Holt? In a matter of life and death, do you not think she would have come to your cabin at midnight, even aboard ship? And it is that with me, a matter of life and death. Less than an hour ago I came to that decision. I could not wait until morning. I had to see you tonight." "And why me?" he asked. "Why not Rosalind or Captain Rifle or some other? Is it because—" He did not finish. He saw the shadow of something gather in her eyes, as if for an instant she had felt a stab of humiliation or of pain, but it was gone as quickly as it came, and very quietly, almost without emotion, she answered him. "I know how you feel. I have tried to place myself in your position. It is all very irregular, as you say, but I am not ashamed. I have come to you as I would want anyone to come to me under similar circumstances, if I were a man. If watching you, thinking about you, making up my mind about you is taking an advantage, then I have been unfair, Mr. Holt. But I am not sorry. I trust you. I know you will believe me good until I am proved bad. I have come to ask you to help me. Would you make it possible for another human being to avert a great tragedy if you found it in your power to do so?" He felt his sense of judgment wavering. Had he been coolly analyzing such a situation in the detached environment of the smoking-room, he would have called any man a fool who hesitated to open his cabin door and show his visitor out. But such a thought did not occur to him now. He was thinking of the handkerchief he had found the preceding midnight. Twice she had come to his cabin at a late hour. "It would be my inclination to make such a thing possible," he said, answering her question. "Tragedy is a nasty thing." She caught the hint of irony in his voice. If anything, it added to her calmness. He was to suffer no weeping entreaties, no feminine play of helplessness and beauty. Her pretty mouth was a little firmer and the tilt of her dainty chin a bit higher. "Of course I can't pay you," she said. "You are the sort of man who would resent an offer of payment for what I am about to ask you to do. But I must have help. If I don't have it, and quickly—" She shuddered slightly and tried to smile. "Something very unpleasant will happen, Mr. Holt," she finished. "If you will permit me to take you to Captain Rifle?" "No. Captain Rifle would question me. He would demand explanations. You will understand when I tell you what I want. And I will do that if I may have your word of honor to hold in confidence what I tell you, whether you help me or not. Will you give me that pledge?" "Yes, if such a pledge will relieve your mind, Miss Standish." He was almost brutally incurious. As he reached for a cigar he did not see the sudden movement she made, as if about to fly from his room, or the quicker throb that came in her throat. When he turned, a faint flush was gathering in her cheeks. "I want to leave the ship," she said. The simplicity of her desire held him silent. "And I must leave it tonight, or tomorrow night, before we reach Cordova." "Is that your problem?" he demanded, astonished. "No, I must leave it in such a way that the world will believe I am dead. I cannot reach Cordova alive." At last she struck home, and he stared at her, wondering if she were insane. Her quiet, beautiful eyes met his own with unflinching steadiness. His brain all at once was crowded with questioning, but no word of it came to his lips. "You can help me," he heard her saying in the same quiet, calm voice, softened so that one could not have heard it beyond the cabin door. "I haven't a plan, but I know you can arrange one, if you will. It must appear to be an accident. I must disappear, fall overboard, anything, just so the world will believe I am dead. It is necessary, and I cannot tell you why. I cannot. Oh, I cannot." A note of passion crept into her voice, but it was gone in an instant, leaving it cold and steady again. A second time she tried to smile. He could see courage and a bit of defiance shining in her eyes. "I know what you are thinking, Mr. Holt. You are asking yourself if I am mad, if I am a criminal, what my reason can be, and why I haven't gone to Rossland or Captain Rifle or someone else. And the only answer I can make is that I have come to you because you are the only man in the world, in this hour, that I have faith in. Some day you will understand, if you help me. If you do not care to help me—" She stopped, and he made a gesture. "Yes, and if I don't, what will happen then?" "I shall be forced to the inevitable," she said. "It is rather unusual, isn't it, to be asking for one's life? But that is what I mean." "I'm afraid I don't quite understand. Isn't it clear, Mr. Holt, I don't like to appear spectacular, and I don't want you to think of me as theatrical, even now. I hate that sort of thing. You must simply believe me when I tell you it is impossible for me to reach Cordova alive. If you do not help me to disappear, help me to live, and at the same time give all others the impression that I am dead, then I must do the other thing. I must really die." For a moment his eyes blazed angrily. He felt like taking her by the shoulders and shaking her, as he would have shaken the truth out of a child. "You come to me with a silly threat like that, Miss Standish? A threat of suicide?" "If you want to call it that, yes." "And you expect me to believe you?" "I had hoped you would." She had his nerves going. There was no doubt of that. He half believed her and half disbelieved. If she had cried, if she had made the smallest effort to work upon his sentiment, he would have disbelieved utterly. But he was not blind to the fact that she was making a brave fight, even though a lie was behind it, and with a consciousness of pride that bewildered him. She was not humiliating herself. Even when she saw the struggle going on within him, she made no effort to turn the balance in her favor. She had stated the facts as she claimed them to be. Now she waited. Her long lashes glistened a little, but her eyes were clear, and her hair glowed softly, so softly that he would never forget it as she stood there with her back against the door, nor the strange desire that came to him, even then, to touch it with his hand. He nipped off the end of his cigar and lighted a match. "It is Rossland," he said. "You're afraid of Rossland?" "In a way, yes. In a large way, no. I would laugh at Rossland if it were not for the other." The other! Why the deuce was she so provokingly ambiguous? And she had no intention of explaining. She simply waited for him to decide. "What other?" he demanded. "I cannot tell you. I don't want you to hate me, and you would hate me if I told you the truth." "Then you confess you are lying," he suggested brutally. Even this did not stir her as he had expected it might. It did not anger her or shame her. But she raised a pale hand and a little handkerchief to her eyes, and he turned toward the open port, puffing at his cigar, knowing she was fighting to keep the tears back. And she succeeded. "No, I am not lying. What I have told you is true. It is because I will not lie that I have not told you more. And I thank you for the time you have given me, Mr. Holt. That you have not driven me from your cabin is a kindness which I appreciate. I have made a mistake, that is all. I thought—" "How could I bring about what you ask?" he interrupted. "I don't know. You are a man. I believed you could plan a way. But I see now how foolish I have been. It is impossible." Her hand reached slowly for the knob of the door. "Yes, you are foolish," he agreed, and his voice was softer. "Don't let such thoughts overcome you, Miss Standish. Go back to your cabin and get a night's sleep. Don't let Rossland worry you. If you want me to settle with that man, good night, Mr. Holt." She was opening the door, and as she went out she turned a little and looked at him, and now she was smiling, and there were tears in her eyes. "Good night." "Good night." The door closed behind her. He heard her retreating footsteps. In half a minute he would have called her back, but it was too late. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of the Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brian Hoos. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 8. For half an hour Allan sat smoking his cigar. Mentally he was not at ease. Mary Standish had come to him like a soldier, and she had left him like a soldier. But in that last glimpse of her face, he had caught for an instant something which she had not betrayed in his cabin. A stab of what he thought was pain in her tear-wet eyes as she smiled, a proud regret, possibly a shadow of humiliation at last. Or it may have been a pity for him. He was not sure. But it was not despair. Not once had she whimpered in look or word, even when the tears were in her eyes and the thought was beginning to impress itself upon him that it was he and not Mary Standish who had shown a yellow streak this night. A half shame fell upon him as he smoked, for it was clear that he had not come up to her judgment of him, or else he was not so big a fool as she had hoped he might be. In his own mind for a time he was at a loss to decide. It was possibly the first time he had ever deeply absorbed himself in the analysis of a woman. It was outside his business. But born and bred of the open country, it was as natural for him to recognize courage as it was for him to breathe. And the girl's courage was unusual now that he had time to think about it. It was this thought of her coolness and her calm refusal to impose her case upon him with greater warmth that comforted him after a little. A young and beautiful woman who was actually facing death would have urged her necessity with more enthusiasm, it seemed to him. Her threat, when he debated it intelligently, was merely thrown in, possibly on the spur of the moment, to give impetus to his decision. She had not meant it. The idea of a girl like Mary Standish committing suicide was stupendously impossible. Her quiet and wonderful eyes, her beauty, and the exquisite care which she gave to herself emphasized the absurdity of such a supposition. She had come to him bravely. There was no doubt of that. She had merely exaggerated the importance of her visit. Even after he had turned many things over in his mind to bolster up this conclusion, he was still not at ease. Against his will he recalled certain unpleasant things which had happened within his knowledge under sudden and unexpected stress of emotion. He tried to laugh the absurd stuff out of his thoughts, and to the end that he might add a new color to his visionings, he exchanged his half-burned cigar for a black-bowled pipe which he filled and lighted. Then he began walking back and forth in his cabin, like a big animal in a small cage, until at last he stood with his head half out of the open port, looking up at the clear stars, and setting the perfume of his tobacco adrift with the soft sea wind. He felt himself growing comforted. Reason seated itself within him again, with sentiment shuttled under his feet. If he had been a little harsh with Miss Standish tonight, he would make up for it by apologizing tomorrow. She would probably have recovered her balance by that time, and they would laugh over her excitement and their little adventure. That is, he would. "I'm not at all curious in the matter," some persistent voice kept telling him, "and I haven't any interest in knowing what irrational whim drove her to my cabin." But he smoked viciously and smiled grimly as the voice kept at him. He would have liked to obliterate Rosalind from his mind. But Rosalind persisted in bobbing up, and with him Miss Mary Standish's words. "If I should make an explanation, you would hate me," or something to that effect. He couldn't remember exactly, and he didn't want to remember exactly, for it was none of his business. In this humor, with half of his thoughts on one side of the fence and half on the other, he put out his light and went to bed. And he began thinking of the range. That was pleasanter. For the 10th time he figured out how long it would be before the glacial twisted ramparts of the Endicott Mountains rose up in the first welcome to his homecoming. Carl Lohman, following on the next ship, would join him in Unalaska. They would go on to Nome together. After that he would spend a week or so in the peninsula, then go up to Kobuk, across the big portage to the Koyukuk and the far headwaters of the north, and still farther, beyond the last trails of civilized men, to his herds and his people. And Stampede Smith would be with him. After a long winter of homesickness, it was all a comforting inducement to sleep and pleasant dreams. But somewhere there was a wrong note in his anticipations tonight. Stampede Smith slipped away from him, and Rosalind took his place, and Keokuk, laughing, changing into Mary Standish with tantalizing deviltry. It was like Keokuk, Allan thought drowsily. She was always tormenting someone. He felt better in the morning. The sun was up, flooding the wall of his cabin when he awoke, and under him he could feel the roll of the open sea. Eastward, the Alaskan coast was a deep blue haze, but the white peaks of the St. Elias Range flung themselves high up against the sun-filled sky behind it, like snowy banners. The Nome was pounding ahead at full speed, and Allan's blood responded suddenly to the impelling thrill of her engines, beating like twin hearts with the mighty force that was speeding them on. This was business. It meant miles foaming away behind them, and a swift biting off of space between him and Unalaska, midway of the Aleutians. He was sorry they were losing time by making the swing up the coast to Cordova, and with Cordova he thought of Mary Standish. He dressed and shaved, and went down to breakfast, still thinking of her. The thought of meeting her again was rather discomforting now that the time of that possibility was actually at hand, for he dreaded moments of embarrassment even when he was not directly accountable for them. But Mary Standish saved him any qualms of conscience which he might have had because of the lack of chivalry the preceding night. She was at the table, and she was not at all disturbed when he seated himself opposite her. There was color in her cheeks, a fragile touch of that warm glow in the heart of the wild rose of the tundras. And it seemed to him there was a deeper, more beautiful light in her eyes than he had ever seen before. She nodded, smiled at him, and resumed a conversation which she had evidently broken for a moment with a lady who sat next to her. It was the first time Allan had seen her interested in this way. He had no intention of listening, but something perverse and compelling, overcame his will. He discovered the lady was going up to teach in a native school in Noorvik on the Kobuk River, and that for many years she had taught in Dawson and knew well the story of Belinda Mulrooney. He gathered that Mary Standish had shown a great interest, for Miss Robson, the teacher, was offering to send her a photograph she possessed of Belinda Mulrooney, if Miss Standish would give her an address. The girl hesitated, then said she was not certain of her destination, but would write Miss Robson at Noorvik. "You will surely keep your promise," urged Miss Robson. "Yes, I will keep my promise." A sense of relief swept over Allan. The words were spoken so softly that he thought she had not wanted him to hear. It was evident that a few hours' sleep and the beauty of the morning had completely changed her mental attitude, and he no longer felt the suspicion of responsibility which had persisted in attaching itself to him. Only a fool, he assured himself, could possibly see a note of tragedy in her appearance now. Nor was she different at luncheon or at dinner. During the day he saw nothing of her, and he was growing conscious of the fact that she was purposely avoiding contact with him. This did not displease him. It allowed him to pick up the threads of other interests in a normal sort of way. He discussed Alaskan politics in the smoking room, smoked his black pipe without fear of giving offense, and listened to the talk of the ship with a freedom of mind which he had not experienced since his first meeting with Miss Standish. Yet as night drew on, and he walked his 2-mile promenade about the deck, he felt gathering about him a peculiar impression of aloneness. Something was missing. He did not acknowledge to himself what it was until, as if to convict him, he saw Mary Standish come out of the door leading from her cabin passageway, and stand alone at the rail of the ship. For a moment he hesitated, then quietly he came up beside her. "It has been a wonderful day, Miss Standish," he said, "and Cordova is only a few hours ahead of us." She scarcely turned her face, and continued to look off into the shrouding darkness of the sea. "Yes, a wonderful day, Mr. Holt," she repeated after him, "and Cordova is only a few hours ahead." Then, in the same soft, unemotional voice, she added, "I want to thank you for last night. You brought me to a great decision." "I fear I did not help you." It may have been fancy of the gathering dusk that made him believe he caught a shuddering movement of her slim shoulders. "I thought there were 2 ways," she said, "but you made me see there was only one." She emphasized that word. It seemed to come with a little tremble in her voice. "I was foolish, but please let us forget. I want to think of pleasanter things. I am about to make a great experiment, and it takes all my courage." "You will win, Miss Standish," he said in a sure voice. "In whatever you undertake, you will win. I know it. If this experiment you speak of is the adventure of coming to Alaska, seeking your fortune, finding your life here, it will be glorious. I can assure you of that." She was quiet for a moment, and then said, "The unknown has always held a fascination for me. When we were under the mountains in Skagway yesterday, I almost told you of an odd faith which I have. I believe I have lived before, a long time ago, when America was very young. At times, the feeling is so strong that I must have faith in it. Possibly I am foolish, but when the mountains swung back like a great door, and we saw Skagway, I knew that sometime, somewhere, I had seen a thing like that before, and I have had strange visions of it. Maybe it is a touch of madness in me, but it is that faith which gives me courage to go on with my experiment. That, and you." Suddenly she faced him, her eyes flaming. "You! And your suspicions and your brutality," she went on, her voice trembling as she drew herself up straight and tense before him. "I wasn't going to tell you, Mr. Holt, but you have given me the opportunity, and it may do you good, after tomorrow. I came to you because I foolishly misjudged you. I thought you were different, like your mountains. I made a great gamble, and set you up on a pedestal as clean and unafraid and believing all things good until you found them bad, and I lost. I was terribly mistaken. Your first thoughts of me when I came to your cabin were suspicious. You were angry and afraid. Yes, afraid. Fearful of something happening which you didn't want to happen. You thought, almost, that I was unclean, and you believed I was a liar, and told me so. It wasn't fair, Mr. Holt. It wasn't fair. There were things which I couldn't explain to you, but I told you. Rosalind knew. I didn't keep everything back. and I believed you were big enough to think that I was not dishonoring you with my friendship, even though I came to your cabin. Oh, I had that much faith in myself. I didn't think I would be mistaken for something unclean and lying. Good God, he cried. Listen to me, Miss Standish. She was gone, so suddenly that his movement to intercept her was futile, and she passed through the door before he could reach her. Again he called her name, but her footsteps were almost running up the passageway. He dropped back, his blood cold, his hands clenched in the darkness, and his face as white as the girl's had been. Her words had held him stunned and mute. He saw himself stripped naked as she believed him to be, and the thing gripped him in a sort of horror. And she was wrong. He had followed what he believed to be good judgment and common sense. If, in doing that, he had been an accursed fool. Determinedly, he started for her cabin, his mind set upon correcting her malformed judgment of him. There was no light coming under her door. When he knocked, there was no answer from within. He waited and tried again, listening for a sound of movement, and each moment he waited he was readjusting himself. He was half glad in the end that the door did not open. He believed Miss Standish was inside, and she would undoubtedly accept the reason for his coming without an apology in words. He went to his cabin, and his mind became increasingly persistent in its disapproval of the wrong viewpoint she had taken of him. He was not comfortable, no matter how he looked at the thing. For her clear eyes, her smooth, glorious hair, and the pride and courage with which she had faced him remained with him overpoweringly. He could not get away from the vision of her as she had stood against the door with tears like diamonds in her eyes. Somewhere he had missed fire. He knew it. Something had escaped him which he could not understand, and she was holding him accountable. The talk of the smoking room did not interest him tonight. His efforts to become part of it were forced. A jazzy concert of piano and string music in the social hall annoyed him, and a little later he watched the dancing with such grimness that someone remarked about it. He saw Rosalind whirling around the floor with a handsome young blonde in his arms. The girl was looking up into his eyes smiling, and her cheek lay unashamed against his shoulder, while Rosalind's face rested against her fluffy hair when they mingled closely with the other dancers. Allan turned away, an unpleasant thought of Rosalind's association with Mary Standish in his mind. He strolled down into the steerage. The Thlinkit people had shut themselves in with curtains of blankets, and from the stillness he judged they were asleep. The evening passed slowly for him after that, until at last he went to his cabin and tried to interest himself in a book. It was something he had anticipated reading, but after a little he wondered if the writing was stupid or if it was himself. The thrill he had always experienced with this particular writer was missing. There was no inspiration. The words were dead. Even the tobacco in his pipe seemed to lack something, and he changed it for a cigar and chose another book. The result was the same. His mind refused to function, and there was no comfort in his cigar. He knew he was fighting against a new thing, even as he subconsciously lied to himself, and he was obstinately determined to win. It was a fight between himself and Mary Standish as she had stood against his door. Mary Standish, the slim beauty of her courage, a score of things that had never touched his life before. He undressed and put on his smoking gown and slippers, repudiating the honesty of the emotions that were struggling for acknowledgment within him. He was a bit mad and entirely a fool, he told himself, but the assurance did him no good. He went to bed, propped himself up against his pillows, and made another effort to read. He half-heartedly succeeded. At 10 o'clock, music and dancing ceased, and stillness fell over the ship. After that, he found himself becoming more interested in the first book he had started to read. His old satisfaction slowly returned to him. He relighted his cigar and enjoyed it. Distantly, he heard the ship's bells. 11 o'clock, and after that, the half-hour and midnight. The printed pages were growing dim, and drowsily he marked his book, placed it on the table, and yawned. They must be nearing Cordova. He could feel the slackened speed of the Nome and the softer throb of her engines. Probably they had passed Cape St. Elias and were drawing inshore. And then, sudden and thrilling, came a woman's scream, a piercing cry of terror, of agony, and of something else that froze the blood in his veins as he sprang from his berth. Twice it came, the second time ending in a moaning wail and a man's husky shout. Feet ran swiftly past his window. He heard another shout, and then a voice of command. He could not distinguish the words, but the ship herself seemed to respond. There came a sudden smoothness of dead engines, followed by the pounding shock of reverse, and the clanging alarm of a bell calling both crews to quarters. Allan faced his cabin door. He knew what had happened. Someone was overboard, and in this moment all life and strength were gone out of his body, for the pale face of Mary Standish seemed to rise for an instant before him, and in her quiet voice she was telling him again that this was the other way. His face went white as he caught up his smoking gown, flung open his door, and ran down the dimly lighted corridor. End of Chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of the Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 9. The reversing of the engines had not stopped the momentum of the ship when Allan reached the open deck. She was fighting, but still swept slowly ahead against the force struggling to hold her back. He heard running feet, voices, and the rattle of davit blocks, and came up as the starboard boat aft began swinging over the smooth sea. Captain Rifle was ahead of him, half-dressed, and the second officer was giving swift commands. A dozen passengers had come from the smoking room. There was only one woman. She stood a little back, partly supported in a man's arms, her face buried in her hands. Allan looked at the man, and he knew from his appearance that she was the woman who had screamed. He heard the splash of the boat as it struck water, and the rattle of oars, but the sound seemed a long distance away. Only one thing came to him distinctly in the sudden sickness that gripped him, and that was the terrible sobbing of the woman. He went to them, and the deck seemed to sway under his feet. He was conscious of a crowd gathering about the empty davits, but he had eyes only for these two. "Was it a man or a woman?" he asked. It did not seem to him it was his voice speaking. The words were forced from his lips. And the other man, with the woman's head crumpled against his shoulder, looked into a face as emotionless as stone. "A woman," he replied. "This is my wife. We were sitting here when she climbed upon the rail and leaped in. My wife screamed when she saw her going." The woman raised her head. She was still sobbing, with no tears in her eyes, but only horror. Her hands were clenched about her husband's arm. She struggled to speak and failed, and the man bowed his head to comfort her. And then Captain Rifle stood at their side. His face was haggard, and a glance told Allan that he knew. "Who was it?" he demanded. "This lady thinks it was Miss Standish." Allan did not move or speak. Something seemed to have gone wrong for a moment in his head. He could not hear distinctly the excitement behind him, and before him things were a blur. The sensation came and passed swiftly, with no sign of it in the immobility of his pale face. "Yes, the girl at your table. The pretty girl. I saw her clearly, and then—" It was the woman. The captain broke in as she caught herself with a choking breath. "It is possible you are mistaken. I cannot believe Miss Standish would do that. We shall soon know. 2 boats are gone and a third lowering." He was hurrying away, throwing the last words over his shoulder. Allan made no movement to follow. His brain cleared itself of shock, and a strange calmness began to possess him. "You are quite sure it was the girl at my table?" he found himself saying. "Is it possible you might be mistaken?" No, said the woman. She was so quiet and pretty that I have noticed her often. I saw her clearly in the starlight, and she saw me just before she climbed to the rail and jumped. I'm almost sure she smiled at me and was going to speak, and then she was gone." "I didn't know until my wife screamed," added the man. "I was seated facing her at the time. I ran to the rail and could see nothing behind but the wash of the ship. I think she went down instantly." Allan turned. He thrust himself silently through a crowd of excited and questioning people, but he did not hear their questions and scarcely sensed the presence of their voices. His desire to make great haste had left him, and he walked calmly and deliberately to the cabin where Mary Standish would be if the woman was mistaken, and it was not she who had leaped into the sea. He knocked at the door only once. Then he opened it. There was no cry of fear or protest from within, and he knew the room was empty before he turned on the electric light. He had known it from the beginning, from the moment he heard the woman scream. Mary Standish was gone. He looked at her bed. There was the depression made by her head in the pillow. A little handkerchief lay on the coverlet, crumpled and twisted. Her few possessions were arranged neatly on the reading table. Then he saw her shoes and her stockings and a dress on the bed, and he picked up one of the shoes and held it in a cold, steady hand. It was a little shoe. His fingers closed about it until it crushed like paper. He was holding it when he heard someone behind him, and he turned slowly to confront Captain Rifle. The little man's face was like gray wax. For a moment neither of them spoke. Captain Rifle looked at the shoe crumpled in Allan's hand. "The boats got away quickly," he said in a husky voice. "We stopped inside the 3rd mile. If she can swim, there is a chance." "She won't swim," replied Allan. "She didn't jump in for that. She is gone." In a vague and detached sort of way he was surprised at the calmness of his own voice. Captain Rifle saw the veins standing out on his clenched hands and in his forehead. Through many years he had witnessed tragedy of one kind and another. It was not strange to him, but a look of wonderment shot into his eyes at Allan's words. It took only a few seconds to tell what had happened the preceding night without going into details. The captain's hand was on Allan's arm when he finished, and the flesh under his fingers was rigid and hard as steel. "We'll talk with Rossland after the boats return," he said. He drew Allan from the room and closed the door. Not until he had re-entered his own cabin did Allan realize he still held the crushed shoe in his hand. He placed it on his bed and dressed. It took him only a few minutes. Then he went and found the captain. Half an hour later the first boat returned. 5 minutes after that a second came in, and then a third. Allan stood back, alone, while the passengers crowded the rail. He knew what to expect, and the murmur of it came to him. Failure. It was like a sob rising softly out of the throats of many people. He drew away. He did not want to meet their eyes or talk with them, or hear the things they would be saying. And as he went, a moan came to his lips, a strangled cry filled with an agony which told him he was breaking down. He dreaded that. It was the first law of his kind to stand up under blows, and he fought against the desire to reach out his arms to the sea and entreat Mary Standish to rise up out of it and forgive him. He drove himself on like a mechanical thing. His white face was a mask through which burned no sign of his grief, and in his eyes was a deadly coldness. Heartless, the woman who had screamed might have said, and she would have been right. His heart was gone. Two people were at Rossland's door when he came up. One was Captain Rifle, the other Marston, the ship's doctor. The captain was knocking when Allan joined them. He tried the door. It was locked. "I can't rouse him," he said, "and I did not see him amongst the passengers." "Nor did I," said Allan. Captain Rifle fumbled with his master key. "I think the circumstances permit," he explained. In a moment he looked up, puzzled. "The door is locked on the inside, and the key is in the lock." He pounded with his fist on the panel. He continued to pound until his knuckles were red. There was still no response. "Odd," he muttered. "Very odd," agreed Allan. His shoulder was against the door. He drew back and with a single crash sent it in. A pale light filtered into the room from a corridor lamp, and the men stared. Rossland was in bed. They could see his face dimly upturned, as if staring at the ceiling, but even now he made no movement and spoke no word. Marston entered and turned on the light. After that, for 10 seconds, no man moved. Then Allan heard Captain Rifle close the door behind them, and from Marston's lips came a startled whisper. "Good God!" Rossland was not covered. He was undressed and flat on his back. His arms were stretched out, his head thrown back, his mouth agape, and the white sheet under him was red with blood. It had trickled over the edges and to the floor. His eyes were loosely closed. After the first shock, Dr. Marston reacted swiftly. He bent over Rossland, and in that moment, when his back was toward them, Captain Rifle's eyes met Allan's. The same thought, and in another instant disbelief, flashed from one to the other. Marston was speaking, professionally cool now. "A knife stab close to the right lung, if not in it, and an ugly bruise over his eye. He's not dead. Let him lie as he is until I return with instruments and dressing." "The door was locked on the inside," said Allan as soon as the doctor was gone, "and the window is closed. It looks like suicide. It is possible there was an understanding between them, and Rossland chose this way instead of the sea." Captain Rifle was on his knees. He looked under the berth, peered into the corners, and pulled back the blanket and sheet. "There is no knife," he said stonily, and in the moment he added, "There are red stains on the window. It was not attempted suicide, it was—" "Murder?" "Yes, if Rossland dies. It was done through the open window. Someone called Rossland to the window, struck him, and then closed the window. Or it is possible, if he were sitting or standing here, that a long-armed man might have reached him. It was a man, Allan. We've got to believe that. It was a man." "Of course, a man," Allan nodded. They could hear Marston returning, and he was not alone. Captain Rifle made a gesture toward the door. "Better go," he advised. "This is a ship's matter, and you won't want to be unnecessarily mixed up in it. Come to my cabin in half an hour. I shall want to see you." The second officer and the purser were with Dr. Marston when Allan passed them, and he heard the door of Rossland's room close behind him. The ship was trembling under his feet again. They were moving away. He went to Mary Standish's cabin and deliberately gathered her belongings and put them in the small handbag with which he had come aboard. Without any effort at concealment, he carried the bag to his room and packed his own dunnage. After that he hunted up Stampede Smith and explained to him that an unexpected change in his plans compelled them to stop at Cordova. He was 5 minutes late in his appointment with the captain. Captain Rifle was seated at his desk when Allan entered his cabin. He nodded toward a chair. "We'll reach Cordova inside an hour," he said. "Dr. Marston says Rossland will live, but of course we cannot hold the Nome in port until he is able to talk. He was struck through the window. I will make oath to that. Have you anything in mind?" "Only one thing," replied Allan. "A determination to go ashore as soon as I can. If it is possible I shall recover her body and care for it. As for Rossland, it is not a matter of importance to me whether he lives or dies. Mary Standish had nothing to do with the assault upon him. It was merely coincident with her own act and nothing more. Will you tell me our location when she leaped into the sea?" He was fighting to retain his calmness, his resolution not to let Captain Rifle see clearly what the tragedy of her death had meant to him. "We were 7 miles off the Eyak River coast, a little south and west. If her body goes ashore it will be on the island or the mainland east of Eyak River. I am glad you are going to make an effort. There is a chance, and I hope you will find her." Captain Rifle rose from his chair and walked nervously back and forth. "It's a bad blow for the ship, her first trip," he said. "But I'm not thinking of the Nome. I'm thinking of Mary Standish. My God, it is terrible. If it had been anyone else, anyone—" His words seemed to choke him, and he made a despairing gesture with his hands. "It is hard to believe, almost impossible to believe she would deliberately kill herself. Tell me again what happened in your cabin." Crushing all emotion out of his voice, Allan repeated briefly certain details of the girl's visit, but a number of things which he had trusted to his confidence he did not betray. He did not dwell upon Rossland's influence or her fear of him. Captain Rifle saw his effort, and when he had finished he gripped his hand, understanding in his eyes. "You're not responsible, not so much as you believe," he said. "Don't take it too much to heart, Allan. But find her. Find her if you can, and let me know. You will do that? You will let me know?" "Yes, I shall let you know." "And Rossland? He is a man with many enemies. I am positive his assailant is still on board." "Undoubtedly." The captain hesitated. He did not look at Allan as he said, "There is nothing in Miss Standish's room. Even her bag is gone. I thought I saw things in there when I was with you. I thought I saw something in your hand, but I must have been mistaken. She probably flung everything into the sea before she went." "Such a thought is possible," agreed Allan evasively. Captain Rifle drummed the top of his desk with his fingertips. His face looked haggard and old in the shaded light of the cabin. "That's all, Allan. God knows I'd give this old life of mine to bring her back if I could. To me she was much like someone a long time dead. That's why I broke ship's regulations when she came aboard so strangely at Seattle without reservation. I'm sorry now. I should have sent her ashore. But she's gone, and it's best that you and I keep to ourselves a little of what we guess. I hope you will find her, and if you do, I shall send you word." They shook hands, and Captain Rifle's fingers still held to Allan's as they went to the door and opened it. A swift change had come in the sky. The stars were gone, and a moaning whisper hovered over the darkened sea. "A thunderstorm," said the captain. His mastery was gone, his shoulders bent, and there was a tremulous note in his voice that compelled Allan to look straight out into darkness. And then he said, "Rossland will be sent to the hospital in Cordova if he lives." Allan made no answer. The door closed softly behind him, and slowly he went through gloom to the rail of the ship and stood there, with the whispered moaning of the sea coming to him out of a pit of darkness. A vast distance away he heard a low intonation of thunder. He struggled to keep hold of himself as he returned to his cabin. Stampede Smith was waiting for him, his dunnage packed in an oilskin bag. Allan explained the unexpected change in his plans. Business in Cordova would make him miss a boat and would delay him at least a month in reaching the tundras. It was necessary for Stampede to go on to the range alone. He could make a quick trip by way of the government railroad of Tanana. After that he would go to Allakakat and then still farther north into the Endicott country. It would be easy for a man like Stampede to find the range. He drew a map, gave him certain written instructions, money, and a final warning not to lose his head and take up gold hunting on the way. While it was necessary for him to go ashore at once, he advised Stampede not to leave the ship until morning, and Stampede was swore an oath he would not fail him. Allan did not explain his own haste and was glad Captain Rifle had not questioned him too closely. He was not analyzing the reasonableness of his action. He only knew that every muscle in his body was aching for physical action and that he must have it immediately or break. The desire was a touch of madness in his blood, a thing which he was holding back by sheer force of will. He tried to shut out the vision of a pale face floating in the sea. He fought to keep a grip on the dispassionate calmness which was a part of him. But the ship itself was battering down his stoic resistance. In an hour since he had heard the scream of the woman, he had come to hate it. He wanted the feel of solid earth under his feet. He wanted with all his soul to reach that narrow strip of coast where Mary Standish was drifting in. But even Stampede saw no sign of the fire that was consuming him. And not until Allan's feet touched land and Cordova lay before him like a great hole in the mountains did the strain give way within him. After he had left the wharf, he stood alone in the darkness, breathing deeply of the mountain smell and getting his bearings. It was more than darkness about him. An occasional light burning dimly here and there gave to it the appearance of a sea of ink threatening to inundate him. The storm had not broken, but it was close, and the air was filled with a creeping warning. The moaning of thunder was low, and yet very near, as if smothered by the hand of a mighty force preparing to take the earth unaware. Through the pit of gloom Allan made his way. He was not lost. 3 years ago he had walked a score of times to the cabin of old Olaf Eriksson, half a mile up the shore, and he knew Eriksson would still be there, where he had squatted for 20 years, and where he had sworn to stay until the sea itself was ready to claim him. So he felt his way instinctively, while a crash of thunder broke over his head. The forces of the night were unleashing. He could hear a gathering tumult in the mountains hidden beyond the wall of blackness, and there came a sudden glare of lightning that illuminated his way. It helped him. He saw a white reach of sand ahead and quickened his steps. And out of the sea he heard more distinctly an increasing sound. It was as if he walked between two great armies that were setting earth and sea a-tremble as they advanced to deadly combat. The lightning came again, and after it followed a discharge of thunder that gave to the ground under his feet a shuddering tremor. It rolled away, echo upon echo, through the mountains, like the booming of signal guns, each more distant than the other. A cold breath of air struck Allan in the face, and something inside him rose up to meet the thrill of storm. He had always loved the rolling echoes of thunder in the mountains and the fire of lightning among their peaks. On such a night, with the crash of the elements about his father's cabin and the roaring voices of the ranges filling the darkness with tumult, his mother had brought him into the world. Love of it was in his blood, a part of his soul, and there were times when he yearned for this talk of the mountains, as others yearn for the coming of spring. He welcomed it now, as his eyes sought through the darkness for a glimmer of the light that always burned from dusk until dawn in Olaf Ericsson's cabin. He saw it at last, a yellow eye peering at him through a slit in an inky wall. A moment later the darker shadow of the cabin rose up in his face, and a flash of lightning showed him the door. In a moment of silence he could hear the patter of huge raindrops on the roof as he dropped his bags and began hammering with his fist to arouse the Swede. Then he flung open the unlocked door and entered, tossing his dunnage to the floor, and shouted the old greeting that Ericsson would not have forgotten, though nearly a quarter of a century had passed since he and Allan's father had tramped the mountains together. He had turned up the wick of the oil lamp on the table when into the frame of an inner door came Ericsson himself, with his huge bent shoulders, his massive head, his fierce eyes, and a great gray beard streaming over his naked chest. He stared for a moment, and Allan flung off his hat, and as the storm broke, beating upon the cabin in a mighty shock of thunder and wind and rain, a bellow of recognition came from Ericsson. They gripped hands. The Swede's voice rose above wind and rain and the rattle of loose windows, and he was saying something about 3 years ago and rubbing the sleep from his eyes, when the strange look in Allan's face made him pause to hear other words than his own. 5 minutes later he opened a door, looking out over the black sea, bracing his arms against it. The wind tore in, beating his whitening beard over his shoulders, and with it came a deluge of rain that drenched him as he stood there. He forced the door shut and faced Allan, a gray, gray ghost of man in the yellow glow of the oil lamp. From then until dawn they waited, and in the first break of that dawn the long black launch of Olaf the Swede nosed its way steadily out to sea. End of chapter 9 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 10 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 10. The wind had died away, but the rain continued, torrential in its downpour, and the mountains grumbled with dying thunder. The town was blotted out, and 50 feet ahead of the hissing nose of the launch Allan could see only a gray wall. Water ran in streams from his rubber slicker, and Olaf's great beard was dripping like a wet rag. He was like a huge gargoyle at the wheel, and in the face of impenetrable gloom he opened speed until the Norden was shooting with the swiftness of a torpedo through the sea. In Olaf's cabin Allan had listened to the folly of expecting to find Mary Standish. Between Eyak River and Katala was a mainland of battered reefs and rocks, and an archipelago of islands in which a pirate fleet might have found 100 hiding places. In his experience of 20 years, Ericsson had never known of the finding of a body washed ashore, and he stated firmly his belief that the girl was at the bottom of the sea. But the impulse to go on grew no less in Allan. It quickened with the straining eagerness of the Norden as the slim craft leaped through the water. Even the drone of thunder and the beat of rain urged him on. To him there was nothing absurd in the quest he was about to make. It was the least he could do, and the only honest thing he could do, he kept telling himself, and there was a chance that he would find her. All through his life had run that element of chance. Usually it was against odds he had won, and there rode with him in the gray dawn a conviction he was going to win now, that he would find Mary Standish somewhere in the sea or along the coast between Eyak River and the first of the islands against which the shoreward current drifted. And when he found her... He had not gone beyond that, but it pressed upon him now, and in moments it overcame him, and he saw her in a way which he was fighting to keep out of his mind. Death had given a vivid clearness to his mental picture of her. A strip of white beach persisted in his mind, and waiting for him on this beach was the slim body of the girl, her pale face turned up to the morning sun, her long hair streaming over the sand. It was a vision that choked him, and he struggled to keep away from it. If he found her like that, he knew at last what he would do. It was the final crumbling away of something inside him, the breaking down of that other Allan Holt, whose negative laws of self-imposed blindness had sent Mary Standish to her death. Truth seemed to mock at him, flaying him for that invulnerable poise in which he had taken such an egoistical pride. For she had come to him in her hour of trouble, and there were 500 others aboard the Nome. She had believed in him, had given him her friendship and her confidence, and at the last had placed her life in his hands. And when he had failed her, she had not gone to another. She had kept her word, proving to him she was not a liar and a fraud, and he knew at last the courage of womanhood and the truth of her words. "You will understand tomorrow." He kept the fight within himself. Olaf did not see it as the dawn lightened swiftly into the beginning of day. There was no chance in the tense lines of his face and the grim resolution in his eyes. And Olaf did not press his folly upon him, but kept the Norden pointed seaward, adding still greater speed as the huge shadow of the headland loomed up in the direction of Hinchinbrook Island. With increasing day the rain subsided. It fell in a drizzle for a time and then stopped. Allan threw off his slicker and wiped the water from his eyes and hair. White mists began to rise, and through them shot faint rose gleams of light. Olaf grunted approbation as he wrung water from his beard. The sun was breaking through over the mountain tops, and straight above, as the mist dissolved, was radiant blue sky. The miracle of change came swiftly in the next half hour. Storm had washed the air until it was like tonic. A salty perfume rose from the sea, and Olaf stood up and stretched himself and shook the wet from his body as he drank the sweetness into his lungs. Shoreward, Allan saw the mountains taking form, and one after another they rose up like living things, their crests catching the fire of the sun. Dark inundations of forests took up the shimmering gleam. Green slopes rolled out from behind veils of smoking vapor, and suddenly, in a final triumph of the sun, the Alaskan coast lay before him in all its glory. The Swede made a gesture of exultation with his free arm, grinning at his companion, pride and the joy of living in his bearded face. But in Allan's there was no change. Dully he sensed the wonder of the day and of sunlight breaking over the mighty ranges to the sea. But something was missing. The soul of it was gone, and the old thrill was dead. He felt the tragedy of it, and his lips tightened even as he met the other's smile, for he no longer made an effort to blind himself to the truth. Olaf began to guess deeply at that truth, now that he could see Allan's face in the pitiless light of the day, and after a little the thing lay naked in his mind. The quest was not a matter of duty, nor was it inspired by the captain of the Nome, as Allan had given him reason to believe. There was more than grimness in the other's face, and a strange sort of sickness lay in his eyes. A little later he observed the straining eagerness with which those eyes scanned the softly undulating surface of the sea. At last he said, "If Captain Rifle was right, the girl went overboard out there," and he pointed. Allan stood up. "But she wouldn't be there now," Olaf added. In his heart he believed she was straight down at the bottom. He turned his boat shoreward. Creeping out from the shadow of the mountains was the white sand of the beach 3 or 4 miles away. A quarter of an hour later a spiral of smoke detached itself from the rocks and timber that came down close to the sea. "That's McCormick's," he said. Allan made no answer. Through Olaf's binoculars he picked out the Scotchman's cabin. It was Sandy McCormick, Olaf had assured him, who knew every eddy and drift in 50 miles of coast, and with his eyes shut could find Mary Standish if she came ashore. And it was Sandy who came down to greet them when Erickson dropped his anchor in shallow water. They leaped out thigh deep and waded to the beach, and in the door of the cabin beyond Allan saw a woman looking down at them wonderingly. Sandy himself was young and ruddy-faced, more like a boy than a man. They shook hands. Then Allan told of the tragedy aboard the Nome and what his mission was. He made a great effort to speak calmly, and believed that he succeeded. Certainly there was no break of emotion in his cold, even voice, and at the same time no possibility of evading its deadly earnestness. McCormick, whose means of livelihood were frequently more unsubstantial than real, listened to the offer of pecuniary reward for his services with something like shock. $50 a day for his time, and an additional $5,000 if he found the girl's body. To Allan the sums meant nothing. He was not measuring dollars, and if he had said 10,000 or 20,000, the detail of price would not have impressed him as important. He possessed as much money as that in the Nome banks, and a little more, and had the thing been practicable, he would as willingly have offered his reindeer herds could they have guaranteed him the possession of what he sought. In Olaf's face McCormick caught a look which explained the situation a little. Allan Holt was not mad. He was as any other man might be who had lost the most precious thing in the world. And unconsciously, as he pledged his services in acceptance of the offer, he glanced in the direction of the little woman standing in the doorway of the cabin. Allan met her. She was a quiet, sweet-looking girl woman. She smiled gravely at Olaf, gave her hand to Allan, and her blue eyes dilated when she heard what had happened aboard the Nome. Allan left the three together and returned to the beach, while between the loading and the lighting of his pipe the Swede told what he had guessed, that this girl whose body would never be washed ashore was the beginning and the end of the world to Allan Holt. For many miles they searched the beach that day, while Sandy McCormick skirmished among the islands south and eastward in a light shore launch. He was in a way a Paul Revere, spreading intelligence, and with Scotch canniness made a good bargain for himself. In a dozen cabins he left details of the drowning and offered a reward of $500 for the finding of the body, so that 20 men and boys and half as many women were seeking before nightfall. And remember, Sandy told each of them, the chances are she'll wash ashore some time between tomorrow and 3 days later, if she comes ashore at all. In the dusk of that first day, Allan found himself 10 miles up the coast. He was alone, for Olaf Eriksson had gone in the opposite direction. It was a different Allan who watched the setting sun dipping into the western sea, with the golden slopes of the mountain reflecting its glory behind him. It was as if he had passed through a great sickness, and up from the earth of his own beloved land had crept slowly into his body and soul a new understanding of life. There was despair in his face, but it was a gentler thing now. The harsh lines of an obstinate will were gone from about his mouth. His eyes no longer concealed their grief, and there was something in his attitude of a man chastened by a consuming fire. He retraced his steps through deepening twilight, and with each mile of his questing return there grew in him that something which had come to him out of death, and which he knew would never leave him. And with this change the droning softness of the night itself seemed to whisper that the sea would not give up its dead. Olaf and Sandy McCormick and Sandy's wife were in the cabin when he returned at midnight. He was exhausted. 7 months in the States had softened him, he explained. He did not inquire how successful the others had been. He knew. The woman's eyes told him, the almost mothering eagerness in them when he came through the door. She had coffee and food ready for him, and he forced himself to eat. Sandy gave a report of what he had done, and Olaf smoked his pipe and tried to speak cheerfully of the splendid weather that was coming tomorrow. Not one of them spoke of Maire Standish. Allan felt the strain they were under, and knew his presence was the cause of it, so he lighted his own pipe after eating and talked to Ellen McCormick about the splendor of the mountains back of Eyak River, and how fortunate she was to have her home in this little corner of paradise. He caught a flash of something unspoken in her eyes. It was a lonely place for a woman, alone without children, and he spoke about children to Sandy, smiling. They should have children, a lot of them. Sandy blushed, and Olaf let out a boom of laughter, but the woman's face was unflushed and serious. Only her eyes betrayed her something wistful and appealing in them as he looked at Sandy. "We're building a new cabin," he said, "and there's 2 rooms in it specially for kids." There was pride in his voice as he made pretense to light a pipe that was already lighted, and pride in the look he gave his young wife. A moment later Ellen McCormick deftly covered with her apron something which lay on a little table near the door through which Allan had to pass to enter his sleeping room. Olaf's eyes twinkled, but Allan did not see. Only he knew there should be children here, where there was surely love. If it did not occur to him as being strange that he, Allan Holt, should think of such a matter at all. The next morning the search was resumed. Sandy drew a crude map of certain hidden places up the east coast, where drifts and cross currents tossed the flotsam of the sea, and Allan set out for these shores with Olaf at the wheel of the Norden. It was sunset when they returned, and in the calm of a wonderful evening, with the comforting peace of the mountains smiling down at them, Olaf believed the time had come to speak what was in his mind. He spoke first of the weird tricks of the Alaskan waters, and of strange forces deep down under the surface which he had never had explained to him, and how he had lost a cask once upon a time, and a week later had run upon it well upon its way to Japan. He emphasized the hide-and-seek playfulness of the undertows and the treachery of them. Then he came bluntly to the point of the matter. It would be better if Maire Standish never did come ashore. It would be days, probably weeks, if it ever happened at all, and there would be nothing about her for Allan to recognize. Better a peaceful resting place at the bottom of the sea. That was what he called it, a peaceful resting place. And in his earnestness to soothe another's grief, he blundered still more deeply into the horror of it all, describing certain details of what flesh and bone could and could not stand, until Allan felt like clubbing him beyond the power of speech. He was glad when he saw the McCormick cabin. Sandy was waiting for them when they waded ashore. Something unusual was in his face, Allan thought, and for a moment his heart waited in suspense. But the Scotchman shook his head negatively and went close to Olaf Erickson. Allan did not see the look that passed between them. He went to the cabin, and Ellen McCormick put a hand on his arm when he entered. It was an unusual thing for her to do, and there was a glow in her eyes which had not been there last night, and a flush in her cheeks, and a new strange note in her voice when she spoke to him. It was almost exultation, something she was trying to keep back. You didn't find her?" she asked. "No." His voice was tired and a little old. "Do you think I shall ever find her?" "Not as you have expected," she answered quietly. "She will never come like that." She seemed to be making an effort. You would give a great deal to have her back, Mr. Holt?" Her question was childish in its absurdity, and she was like a child looking at him as she did in this moment. He forced a smile to his lips and nodded. "Of course. Everything I possess." You loved her?" Her voice trembled. It was odd she should ask these questions, but the probing did not sting him. It was not a woman's curiosity that inspired them, and the comforting softness in her voice did him good. He had not realized before how much he wanted to answer that question, not only for himself, but for someone else, aloud. "Yes, I did." The confession almost startled him. It seemed an amazing confidence to be making under any circumstances, and especially upon such brief acquaintance. But he said no more, though in Ellen McCormick's face and eyes was a tremulous expectancy. He stepped into the little room which had been his sleeping place, and returned with his dunnage sack. Out of this he took the bag in which were Mary Standish's belongings, and gave it to Sandy's wife. It was a matter of business now, and he tried to speak in a businesslike way. "Her things are inside. I got them in her cabin. If you find her after I'm gone, you will need them. You understand, of course. And if you don't find her, keep them for me. I shall return some day." It seemed hard for him to give his simple instructions. He went on. "I don't think I shall stay any longer, but I will leave a certified check at Cordova, and it will be turned over to your husband when she is found. And if you do find her, you will look after her yourself, won't you, Mrs. McCormick?" Ellen McCormick choked a little as she answered him, promising him to do what he asked. He would always remember her as a sympathetic little thing, and half an hour later, after he had explained everything to Sandy, he wished her happiness when he took her hand in saying good-bye. Her hand was trembling. He wondered at it, and said something to Sandy's about the priceless value of happiness such as his, as they went down to the beach. The velvety darkness of the sky was athrob with the heartbeat of stars when the Northern's shimmering trail led once more out to sea. Allan looked up at them, and his mind groped strangely in the infinity that lay above him. He had never measured it before. Life had been too full. But now it seemed so vast, and its range in the tundras so far away, that a great loneliness seized upon him as he turned his eyes to look back at the dimly white shoreline dissolving swiftly in the gloom that lay beneath the mountains. End of chapter 10 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander.
Of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 11. That night, in Olaf's cabin, Allan put himself back on the old track again. He made no effort to minimize the tragedy that had come into his life, and he knew its effect upon him would never be wiped away, and that Mary Standish would always live in his thoughts, no matter what happened in the years to come. But he was not the sort to let any part of himself wither up and die because of a blow that had darkened his mental vision of things. His plans lay ahead of him, his old ambitions and his dreams of achievement. They seemed pulseless and dead now, but he knew it was because his own fire had temporarily burned out, and he realized the vital necessity of building it up again. So he first wrote a letter to Ellen McCormick, and in this place a second letter, carefully sealed, which was not to be opened unless they found Mary Standish, and which contained something he had found impossible to put into words in Sandy's cabin. It was trivial and embarrassing when spoken to others, but it meant a great deal to him. Then he made the final arrangements for Olaf to carry him to Seward in the Norden, for Captain Rifle's ship was well on her way to Unalaska. Thought of Captain Rifle urged him to write another letter in which he told briefly the disappointing details of his search. He was rather surprised the next morning to find he had entirely forgotten Rossland. While he was attending to his affairs at the bank, Olaf secured information that Rossland was resting comfortably in the hospital, and had not one chance in 10 of dying. It was not Allan's intention to see him. He wanted to hear nothing he might have to say about Mary Standish. To associate them in any way, as he thought of her now, was little short of sacrilege. He was conscious of the change in himself, for it was a rather amazing upsetting of the original Allan Holt. That person would have gone to Rossland with the deliberate and businesslike intention of sifting the matter to the bottom that he might disprove his own responsibility and set himself right in his own eyes. In self-defense he would have given Rossland an opportunity to break down with cold facts the disturbing something which his mind had unconsciously built up. But the new Allan revolted. He wanted to carry the thing away with him. He wanted it to live. And so it went with him, uncontaminated by any truths or lies which Rossland might have told him. They left Cordova early in the afternoon, and at sunset that evening camped on the tip of a wooded island a mile or two from the mainland. Olaf knew the island, and had chosen it for reasons of his own. It was primitive and alive with birds. Olaf loved the birds, and the cheer of their vesper song and bedtime twitter comforted Allan. He seized an axe, and for the first time in 7 months his muscles responded to the swing of it. And Ericsson, old as his years in the way of the North, whistled loudly and rumbled a bit of crude song through his beard as he lighted a fire, knowing the medicine of the big open was getting its hold on Allan again. To Allan it was like coming to the edge of home once more. It seemed an age, an infinity, since he had heard the sputtering of bacon in an open skillet, and the bubbling of coffee over a bed of coals, with the mysterious darkness of the timber gathering in about him. He loaded his pipe after chopping, and sat watching Olaf as he mothered the half-baked bannock loaf. It made him think of his father. 1,000 times the two must have camped like this in the days when Alaska was new, and there were no maps to tell them what lay beyond the next range. Olaf felt resting upon him something of the responsibility of a doctor, and after supper he sat with his back to a tree and talked of the old days as if they were yesterday and the day before, with tomorrow always the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow which he had pursued for 30 years. He was 60 just a week ago this evening, he said, and he was beginning to doubt if he would remain on the beach at Cordova much longer. Siberia was dragging him, that forbidden world of adventure and mystery and monumental opportunity which lay only a few miles across the strait from the Seward Peninsula. In his enthusiasm he forgot Allan's tragedy. He cursed Cossack law and the prohibitory measures to keep Americans out. More gold was over there than had ever been dreamed of in Alaska. Even the mountains and rivers were unnamed, and he was going, if he lived another year or two, going to find his fortune or his end in the Stanovi Mountains and among the Kachaki tribes. Twice he had tried it since his old comrade had died, and twice he had been driven out. The next time he would know how to go about it, and he invited Allan to go with him. There was a thrill in this talk of a land so near, scarcely a night ride across the neck of Bering Sea, and yet as proscribed as the sacred plains of Tibet. It stirred old desires in Allan's blood, for he knew that of all frontiers the Siberian would be the last and the greatest, and that not only men but nations would play their part in the breaking of it. He saw the red gleam of firelight in Olaf's eyes. "And if we don't go in first from this side, Allan, the yellow fellows will come out some day from that," rumbled the old sourdough, striking his pipe in the hollow of his hand. "And when they do, they won't come over to us in ones and twos and threes, but in millions. That's what the yellow fellows will do when they once get started, and it's up to a few Alaska Jacks and tough nut Bills to get their feet planted first on the other side. Will you go?" Allan shook his head. "Some day, but not now." The old flash was in his eyes, and he was seeing the fight ahead of him again, the fight to do his bit in striking the shackles of misgovernment from Alaska and rousing the world to an understanding of the menace which hung over her like a smouldering cloud. "But you're right about the danger," he said. "It won't come from Japan to California. It will pour like a flood through Siberia and jump to Alaska in a night. It isn't the danger of the yellow man alone, Olaf. You've got to combine that with Bolshevism, the menace of blackest Russia, a disease which, if it crosses the little neck of the water and gets hold of Alaska, will shake the American continent to bedrock. It may be a generation from now, maybe a century, but it's coming sure as God makes light if we let Alaska go down and out. And my way of preventing it is different from yours." He stared into the fire, watching the embers flare up and die. "I am not proud of the States," he went on, as if speaking to something which he saw in the flames. "I can't be, after the ruin their unintelligent propaganda and legislation have brought upon Alaska. But they're our salvation, and conditions are improving. I concede we have factions in Alaska, and we are not at all unanimous in what we want. It's going to be largely a matter of education. We can't take Alaska down to the States. We've got to bring them up to us. We must make a large part of 110 million Americans understand. We must bring 1 million of them up here before that danger flood we speak of comes beyond the Gulf of Anadyr. It's God's own country we have north of 58, Olaf, and we have 10 times the wealth of California. We can care for 1 million people easily, but bad politics and bad judgment, both here in Alaska and at Washington, won't let them come. With coal enough under our feet to last 1,000 years, we are buying fuel from the States. We've got billions in copper and oil, but can't touch them. We should have some of the world's greatest manufacturing plants, but we cannot, because everything up here is locked away from us. I repeat, that isn't conservation. If they had applied a little of it to the salmon industry, but they didn't, and the salmon are going like the buffalo of the plains. The destruction of the salmon shows what will happen to us if the bars are let down all at once to the financial banditti. Understanding and common sense must guard the gates. The fight we must win is to bring about an honest and reasonable judgment, Olaf. And that fight will take place right here in Alaska and not in Siberia. And if we don't win—" He raised his eyes from the fire and smiled grimly into Olaf's bearded face. Then we can count on that thing coming across the neck of sea from the Gulf of Anadyr," he finished. "And if it ever does come, the people of the States will at last face the tragic realization of what Alaska could have meant to the nation." The force of old spirit surged uppermost in Allan again, and after that, for an hour or more, something lived for him in the glow of the fire which Olaf kept burning. It was the memory of Mary Standish, her quiet, beautiful eyes gazing at him, her pale face taking form in the lacy wisps of birch smoke. His mind pictured her in the flame glow as she had listened to him that day in Skagway, when he had told her of this fight that was ahead. And it pleased him to think she would have made this same fight for Alaska if she had lived. It was a thought which brought a painful thickening in his breath, for always these visions which Olaf could not see ended with Mary Standish as she had faced him in his cabin, her back against the door, her lips trembling, and her eyes softly radiant with tears in the broken pride of that last moment of her plea for life. He could not have told how long he slept that night. Dreams came to him in restless slumber, and always they awakened him, so that he was looking at the stars again and trying not to think. In spite of the grief in his soul, they were pleasant dreams, as though some gentle force were at work in him subconsciously to wipe away the shadows of tragedy. Mary Standish was with him again, between the mountains at Skagway. She was at his side, in the heart of the tundras, the sun in her shining hair and eyes, and all about them the wonder of wild roses and purple iris and white seas of sedge cotton and yellow-eyed daisies, and birds singing in the gladness of summer. He heard the birds, and he heard the girl's voice answering them in her happiness, and turning that happiness from the radiance of her eyes upon him. When he awoke, it was with a little cry, as if some one had stabbed him, and Olaf was building a fire, and dawn was breaking in rose gleams over the mountains. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 12. This first night and dawn in the herd of his wilderness, with a new import of life gleaming down at him from the mighty peaks of the Chugach and Kenai ranges, marked the beginning of that uplift which drew Allan out of the pit into which he had fallen. He understood now how it was that through many long years his father had worshipped the memory of a woman who had died. It seemed to him an infinity ago. Unnumbered times he had seen the miracle of her presence in his father's eyes, and once, when they had stood overlooking a sun-filled valley back in the mountains, the elder Holt had said, 27 years ago, the 12th day of last month, Mother went with me through this valley, Allan. Do you see the little bend in the creek with the great rock in the sun? We rested there before you were born. He had spoken of that day as if it had been but yesterday, and Allan recalled the strange happiness in his father's face as he had looked down upon something in the valley which no other but himself could see. And it was happiness, the same strange soul-aching happiness that began to build itself a house close up against the grief in Allan's heart. It would never be a house quite empty. Never again would he be alone. He knew at last it was an undying part of him, as it had been a part of his father, clinging to him in sweet pain, encouraging him, pressing gently upon him the beginning of a great faith that somewhere beyond was a place to meet again. In the many days that followed, it grew in him, but in a way no man or woman could see. It was a secret about which he built a wall, setting it apart from that stoical placidity of his nature which some people called indifference. Olaf could see farther than others because he had known Allan's father as a brother. It had always been that way with the elder Holt, straight, clean, deep breathing, and with a smile on his lips in times of hurt. Olaf had seen him face death like that. He had seen him rise up with awesome courage from the beautiful form that had turned to clay under his eyes, and fight forth again into a world burned to ashes. Something of that look which he had seen in the eyes of the father he saw in Allan's. In these days, when they nosed their way up the Alaskan coast together, only to himself did Allan speak the name of Mary Standish, just as his father had kept Elizabeth Holt's name sacred in his own heart. Olaf, with mildly casual eyes and strong in the possession of memories, observed how much alike they were, but discretion held his tongue, and he said nothing to Allan of many things that ran in his mind. He talked of Siberia, always of Siberia, and did not hurry on the way to seaward. Allan himself felt no great urge to make haste. The days were soft with the premature breath of summer. The nights were cold and filled with stars. Day after day, mountains hung about them like mighty castles, whose battlements reached up into the cloud draperies of the sky. They kept close to the mainland and among the islands, camping early each evening. Birds were coming northward by the thousand, and each night Olaf's campfire sent up the delicious aroma of flesh pots and roasts. When at last they reached seaward, and the time came for Olaf to turn back, there was an odd blinking in the old Swede's eyes, and as a final comfort, Allan told him again that the day would probably come when he would go to Siberia with him. After that he watched the Norden until the little boat was lost in the distance of the sea. Alone, Allan felt once more greater desire to reach his own country, and he was fortunate. 2 days after his arrival at Seawards, the steamer which carried mail and the necessities of life to the string of settlements reaching 1,000 miles out into the Pacific left Resurrection Bay, and he was given passage. Thereafter the countless islands of the North Pacific drifted behind, while always northward were the gray cliffs of the Alaskan peninsula, with the ramparted ranges beyond, glistening with glaciers, smoking with occasional volcanoes, and at times so high their snowy peaks were lost in the clouds. First touching the hatchery at Karluk, and then the canneries at Uyak and Chignik, the mailboat visited the settlements on the island of Unga, and thence covered swiftly the 300 miles to Dutch Harbor and Unalaska. Again he was fortunate. Within a week he was berthed on a freighter, and on the 12th day of June set foot in Nome. His homecoming was unheralded, but the little gray town with its peculiar black shadowings, its sea of stovepipes, and its 2 solitary brick chimneys brought a lump of joy into his throat as he watched its growing outlines from the small boat that brought him ashore. He could see one of the only 2 brick chimneys in northern Alaska gleaming in the sun. Beyond it, 50 miles away, were the ragged peaks of the Sawtooth Range, looking as if one might walk to them in half an hour, and over all the world between seemed to hover a misty gloom. But it was where he had lived, where happiness and tragedy and unforgettable memories had come to him, and the welcoming of its frame buildings, its crooked streets, and what to others might have been ugliness was a warm and thrilling thing. For there were his people. Here were the men and women who were guarding the northern door of the world, an epic place, filled with strong hearts, courage, and a love of country as inextinguishable as one's love of life. From this drab little place, shut out from all the world for half the year, young men and women went down to southern universities, to big cities, to the glamour and lure of outside, but they always came back. Nome called them. Its loneliness in winter, its gray gloom in springtime, its glory in summer and autumn. It was the breeding place of a new race of men, and they loved it as Allan loved it. To him the black wireless tower meant more than the Statue of Liberty, the three weather-beaten church spires more than the architectural colossi of New York and Washington. Beside one of the churches he had played as a boy. He had seen the steeples painted, he had helped make the crooked streets. And his mother had laughed and lived and died here, and his father's footprints had been in the white sands of the beach when tents dotted the shore like gulls. When he stepped ashore, people stared at him and then greeted him. He was unexpected, and the surprise of his arrival added strength to the grip which men's hands gave him. He had not heard voices like theirs down in the States, with a gladness in them that was almost excitement. Small boys ran up to his side, and with white men came the Eskimo, grinning and shaking his hands. Word traveled swiftly that Allan Holt had come back from the States. Before the day was over, it was on its way to Shelton and Candle and Kevalik and Kotzebue Sound. Such was the beginning of his homecoming. But ahead of the news of his arrival, Allan walked up Front Street, stopped at Balke's restaurant for a cup of coffee, and then dropped casually into Loman's offices in the Tin Bank building. For a week Allan remained in Nome. Carl Loman had arrived a few days before, and his brothers were in from the big ranges of the Coris Peninsula. It had been a good winter and promised to be a tremendously successful summer. The Loman herds would exceed 40,000 head when the final figures were in. 100 other herds were prospering, and the Eskimo and Lapps were full-cheeked and plump with good feeding and prosperity. 1/3 reindeer were on the hoof in Alaska, and the breeders were exultant. Pretty good when compared with the fact that in 1902 there were less than 5,000. In another 20 years there would be 10 million. But with this prosperity of the present and still greater promise for the future, Allan sensed the undercurrent of unrest and suspicion in Nome. After waiting and hoping through another long winter, with their best men fighting for Alaska's salvation at Washington, word was traveling from mouth to mouth, from settlement to settlement, and from range to range, that the bureaucracy which misgoverned them from thousands of miles away was not lifting a hand to relieve them. Federal office holders refused to surrender their deadly power, and their strangling methods were to continue. Coal, which should cost $10 a ton if dug from Alaska mines, would continue to cost $40. Cold storage from Nome would continue to be $52 a ton, when it should be $20. Commercial brigandage was still given letters of marque. Bureaus were fighting amongst themselves for greater power, and in the turmoil Alaska was still chained like a starving man just outside the reach of all the milk and honey in a wonderful land. Pauperizing, degrading, actually killing the political misrule that had already driven 25% of Alaska's population from their homes was to continue indefinitely. A president of the United States had promised to visit the mighty land of the North and see with his own eyes. But would he come? There had been other promises, many of them, and promises had always been futile. but it was a hope that crept through Alaska, and upon this hope men whose courage never died began to build. Freedom was on its way, even if slowly. Justice must triumph ultimately, as it always triumphed. Rusty keys would at last be turned in the locks which had kept from Alaskans all the riches and resources of their country, and these men were determined to go on building against odds, that they might be better prepared for that freedom of human endeavor when it came. In these days, when the fires of achievement needed to be encouraged and not smothered, neither Allan nor Carl Lomen emphasized the menace of gigantic financial interests like that controlled by John Graham, interests fighting to do away with the best friend Alaska ever had, the Biological Survey, and backing with all their power the ruinous legislation to put Alaska in the control of a group of 5 men, that an aggrandizement even more deadly than a suffocating policy of conservation might be more easily accomplished. Instead, they spread the optimism of men possessed of inextinguishable faith. The blackest days were gone. Rifts were breaking in the clouds. Intelligence was creeping through like rays of sunshine. The end of Alaska's serfdom was near at hand. So they preached, and knew they were preaching truth, for what remained of Alaska's men after years of hopelessness and distress were fighting men. And the women who had remained with them were the mothers and wives of a new nation in the making. These mothers and wives Allan met during his week in Nome. He would have given his life if a few million people in the States could have known these women. Something would have happened then, and the sisterhood of half a continent, possessing the power of the ballot, would have opened their arms to them. Men like John Graham would have gone out of existence. Alaska would have received her birthright. For these women were of the kind who greeted the sun each day, and the gloom of winter with something greater than hope in their hearts. They, too, were builders. Fear of God and love of land lay deep in their souls, and side by side with their menfolk they went on this epic struggle for the building of a nation at the top of the world. Many times during this week Allan felt it in his heart to speak of Mary Standish, but in the end not even to Carl Lomen did word of her escape his lips. The passing of each day had made her more intimately a part of him, and a secret part. He could not tell people about her. He even made evasions when questioned about his business and experiences at Cordova and up the coast. Curiously, she seemed nearer to him when he was away from other men and women. He remembered it had been that way with his father, who was always happiest when in the deep mountains or the unending tundras. And so Allan thrilled with an inner gladness when his business was finished and the day came for him to leave Nome. Carl Lomen went with him as far as the big herd on Corris Peninsula. For 100 miles up to Shelton they rode over a narrow gauge, 4-foot railway on a hand car drawn by dogs. And it seemed to Allan at times as though Mary Standish were with him, riding in this strange way through a great wilderness. He could see her. That was the strange thing which began to possess him. There were moments when her eyes were shining softly upon him, her lips smiling, her presence so real he might have spoken to her if Lomen had not been at his side. He did not fight against these visionings. It pleased him to think of her going with him into the heart of Alaska, riding the picturesque pup-mobile, losing herself in the mountains and in his tundras, with all the wonder and glory of a new world breaking upon her a little at a time, like the unfolding of a great mystery. For there was both wonder and glory in these countless miles running ahead and drifting behind, and the miracle of northward sweeping life. The days were long. Night, as Mary Standish had always known night, was gone. On the 20th of June there were 20 hours of day, with a dim and beautiful twilight between the hours of 11 and 1. Sleep was no longer a matter of the rising and setting of the sun, but was regulated by the hands of the watch. A world frozen to the core for 7 months was bursting open like a great flower. From Shelton, Allan and his companion visited the 80 or 90 people at Candle, and thence continued down the Kevalik River to Kevalik, on Kotzebue Sound. A Loman power boat run by Lapps carried them to Corris Peninsula, where for a week Allan remained with Loman and his huge herd of 15,000 reindeer. He was eager to go on, but tried to hide his impatience. Something was urging him, whipping him on to greater haste. For the first time in months he heard the crackling thunder of reindeer hoofs, and the music of it was like a wild call from his own herds hurrying him home. He was glad when the week-end came and his business was done. The power boat took him to Kotzebue. It was night as his watch went when Paul Davidovich started up the delta of the Kuberg River with him in a Lighterage Company's boat. But there was no darkness. In the afternoon of the 4th day they came to the Redstone, 200 miles above the mouth of the Kobuk as the river winds. They had supper together on the shore. After that Paul Davidovich turned back with the slow sweep of the current, waving his hand until he was out of sight. Not until the sound of the Russian's motorboat was lost in distance did Allan sense fully the immensity of the freedom that swept upon him. At last, after months that had seemed like so many years, he was alone. North and eastward stretched the unmarked trail which he knew so well, 150 miles straight as a bird might fly, almost unmapped, unpeopled, right up to the doors of his range in the slopes of the Endicott Mountains. A little cry from his own lips gave him a start. It was as if he had called out aloud to Tautuk and Amuktulik and to Keok and Navadluk, telling them he was on his way home and would soon be there. Never had his hidden land which he had found for himself seemed so desirable as it did in this hour. There was something about it that was all mothering, all good, all sweetly comforting to that other thing which had become a part of him now. It was holding out its arms to him, understanding, welcoming, inspiring him to travel strongly and swiftly the space between, and he was ready to answer its call. He looked at his watch. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He had spent a long day with the Russian, but he felt no desire for rest or sleep. The musk tang of the tundras coming to him through the thin timber of the river courses worked like an intoxicant in his blood. It was the tundras he wanted, before he lay down upon his back with his face to the stars. He was eager to get away from timber and to feel the immeasurable space of the big country, the open country about him. What fool had given to it the name of Barren Lands? What idiots people were to lie about it in that way on the maps. He strapped his pack over his shoulders and seized his rifle. Barren Lands. He set out walking like a man in a race, and long before the twilight hours of sleep they were sweeping out ahead of him in all their glory, the barren lands of the map makers, his paradise. On a knoll he stood in the golden sun and looked about him. He set his pack down and stood with bared head, a whispering of cool wind in his hair. If Maire Standish could have lived to see this! He stretched out his arms as if pointing for her eyes to follow, and her name was in his heart and whispering on his silent lips. Immeasurable the tundras reached ahead of him, rolling, sweeping, treeless, green and golden, and a glory of flowers, athrill with a life no forest land had ever known. Under his feet was a crush of forget-me-nots and of white and purple violets, their sweet perfume filling his lungs as he breathed. Ahead of him lay a white sea of yellow-eyed daisies, with purple iris high as his knees in between. And as far as he could see, waving softly in the breeze, was the cotton-tufted sedge he loved. The pods were green. In a few days they would be opening, and the tundras would be white carpets. He listened to the call of life. It was about him everywhere, a melody of bird life, subdued and sleepy, even though the sun was still warmly aglow in the sky. 100 times he had watched this miracle of bird instinct, the going to bed of feathered creatures in the weeks and months when there was no real night. He picked up his pack and went on. From a pool hidden in the lush grasses of a distant hollow came to him the twilight honking of nesting geese and the quacking content of wild ducks. He heard the reed-like musical notes of a lone organ duck, and the plaintive cries of plover, and farther out, where the shadows seemed deepening against the rim of the horizon, rose the harsh, rolling notes of cranes and the raucous cries of the loons. And then, from a clump of willows near him, came a chirping twitter of a thrush whose throat was tired for the day, and the sweet, sleepy evening song of a robin. Night. Allan laughed softly, the pale flush of the sun in his face. Bedtime. He looked at his watch. It was 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, and the flowers still answering to the glow of the sun. And the people down there in the States called it a frozen land, a hell of ice and snow at the end of the earth, a place of the survival of the fittest. Well, to just such extremes had stupidity and ignorance gone through all the years of history, even though men called themselves super creatures of intelligence and knowledge. It was humorous, and it was tragic. At last he came to a shining pool between two tufted ridges, and in this velvety hollow the twilight was gathering like a shadow in a cup. A little creek ran out of the pool, and here Allan gathered soft grass and spread out his blankets. A great stillness drew in about him, broken only by the old squaws and the loons. At 11 o'clock he could still see clearly the sleeping waterfowl on the surface of the pool. But the stars were appearing. It grew duskier, and the rose tint of the sun faded into purple gloom as pale night drew near. 4 hours of rest that was neither darkness nor day. With a pillow of sedge and grass under his head, he slept. The song and cry of bird life wakened him, and at dawn he bathed in the pool, with dozens of fluffy new-born ducks dodging away from him among the grasses and reeds. That day and the next and the day after that he traveled steadily into the heart of the tundra country, swiftly and almost without rest. It seemed to him at last that he must be in that country where all the bird life of the world was born, for wherever there was water in the pools and little streams and the hollows between the ridges, the voice of it in the morning was a babble of sound. Out of the sweet breast of the earth he could feel the irresistible pulse of motherhood filling him with its strength and its courage, and whispering to him its everlasting message that because of the glory and need and faith of life had God created this land of 20-hour day and 4-hour twilight. In it, in these days of summer, was no abiding place for gloom. Yet in his own heart, as he drew near to his home, was a place of darkness which his light could not quite enter. The tundras had made Mary Standish more real to him. In the treeless spaces, in the vast reaches, with only the sky shutting out his vision, she seemed to be walking near to him, almost with her hand in his. At times it was like a torture inflicted upon him for his folly, and when he visioned what might have been, and recalled too vividly that it was he who had stilled with death that living glory which dwelt with him in spirit now, a crying sob of which he was not ashamed came from his lips. For when he thought too deeply he knew that Mary Standish would have lived if he had said other things to her that night aboard the ship. She had died not for him, but because of him. Because in his failure to live up to what she believed she had found in him, he had broken down what must have been her last hope and her final faith. If he had been less blind, and God had given him the inspiration of a greater wisdom, she would have been walking with him now, laughing in the rose-tinted dawn, growing tired amid the flowers, sleeping under the clear stars, happy and unafraid, and looking to him for all things. At least so he dreamt, in his immeasurable loneliness. He did not tolerate the thought that other forces might have called her, even had she lived, and that she might not have been his to hold and to fight for. He did not question the possibility of shackles and chains that might have bound her, or other inclinations that might have led her. He claimed her, now that she was dead, and knew that living he would have possessed her. Nothing could have kept him from that, but she was gone, and for that he was accountable. And the fifth night he lay sleepless under the stars, and like a boy cried for her with his face upon his arm. And when morning came and went on, never had the world seemed so vast and empty. His face was gray and haggard, a face grown suddenly old, and he traveled slowly, for the desire to reach his people was dying within him. He could not laugh with Keok and Nawadlook, or give the old tundra call to Amok Toolik and his people, who would be riotous in their happiness at his return. They loved him. He knew that. Their love had been a part of his life, and the knowledge that his response to this love would be at best a poor and broken thing filled him with dread. A strange sickness crept through his blood. It grew in his head, so that when noon came he did not trouble himself to eat. It was late in the afternoon when he saw far ahead of him the clump of cottonwoods near the warm springs, very near his home. Often he had come to these old cottonwoods, an oasis of timber lost in the great tundras, and he had built himself a little camp among them. He loved the place. It had seemed to him that now and then he must visit the forlorn trees, to give them cheer and comradeship. His father's name was carved in the bole of the greatest of them all, and under it the date and day when the elder Holt had discovered them in a land where no man had gone before. And under his father's name was his mother's, and under that his own. He had made of the place a sort of shrine, a green and sweet-flowered tabernacle of memories, and its bird song and peace in summer, and the weird aloneness of it in winter, had played their parts in the making of his soul. Through many months he had anticipated this hour of his homecoming, when in the distance he would see the beckoning welcome of the old cottonwoods, with the rolling foothills and frosted peaks of the Endicott Mountains beyond. And now he was looking at the trees and the mountains, and something was lacking in the thrill of them. He came up from the west, between two willow ridges through which ran the little creek from the warm springs, and he was within a quarter of a mile of them when something stopped him in his tracks. At first he thought the sound was the popping of guns, but in a moment he knew it could not be so, and the truth flashed suddenly upon him. This day was the 4th of July, and someone in the cottonwoods was shooting firecrackers. A smile softened his lips. He recalled Keok's mischievous habit of lighting a whole bunch at one time, for which apparent wastefulness Nawadlook never failed to scold her. They had prepared for his homecoming with a celebration, and Tautuk and Amuk Tulik had probably imported a supply of big bangs from Alakakat or Tanana. The oppressive weight inside him lifted, and the smile remained on his lips. And then, as if commanded by a voice, his eyes turned to the dead cottonwood stub which had sentineled the little oasis of trees for many years. At the very crest of it, floating bravely in the breeze that came with the evening sun, was an American flag. He laughed softly. These were the people who loved him, who thought of him, who wanted him back. His heart beat faster, stirred by the old happiness, and he drew himself quickly into a strip of willows that grew almost up to the cottonwoods. He would surprise them. He would walk suddenly in among them, unseen and unheard. That was the sort of thing that would amaze and delight them. He came to the first of the trees and concealed himself carefully. He heard the popping of individual firecrackers and the louder bang of one of the giants that always made Nawadlook put her fingers in her pretty ears. He crept stealthily over a knoll, down through a hollow, and then up again to the opposite crest. It was as he had thought. He could see Keok 100 yards away, standing on the trunk of a fallen tree, and as he looked, she tossed another bunch of sputtering crackers away from her. The others were probably circled about her, out of his sight, watching her performance. He continued cautiously, making his way that he could come up behind a thick growth of bush unseen, within a dozen paces of them. At last he was as near as that to her, and Keok was still standing on the log with her back toward him. It puzzled him that he could not see or hear the others, and something about Keok puzzled him too. And then his heart gave a sudden throb and seemed to stop its beating. It was not Keok on the log, and it was not Nawadlook. He stood up and stepped out from his hiding place. The slender figure of the girl on the log turned a little, and he saw the glint of golden sunshine in her hair. He called out, "Keok!" Was he mad? Had the sickness in his head turned his brain? And then, "Mary!" he called. "Mary Standish!" She turned. And in that moment Allan Holt's face was the color of gray rock. It was the dead he had been thinking of, and it was the dead that had risen before him now. For it was Mary Standish who stood there on the old cottonwood log, shooting firecrackers in this evening of his homecoming. End of chapter 12 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander.